Hey, friends. Welcome to another VOXOLOGY podcast. Tim's got to start reading this massive book because we have a book club in a couple of weeks, bro. You're going to have some time on a plane because we're recording this before we go down to Southern California for our World Relief event that will have taken place already by the time that you hear this. But for us, it is in the future.
This is interstellar.
Yeah, totally. I'm going to push some books off the bookshelf and tell us that we did great. So yay us. So glad to do this with Matt Sorens and World Relief. So it went amazing, says our future
It was
selves.
so good.
It was
that
great.
One thing that you brought up, that question that you asked was
oh
really
my
profound.
Goodness. And that song you played, bro,
oh,
the
man.
prayers of the people at the end. Let's go. And if you're tuning in on the YouTubes, Tim looks a lot like Toby Mac today, a young Toby Mac from DC Talk. And he's got his Pearl Jam shirt on for his creds and a lavender hat. And all of that just says Tim simply defies description, and it's absolutely glorious. Another week has gone by, Tim, and so much more to talk about. But you know what? We're going to be focused today. Oh. We're going to try to get through some more of this biblical stuff because my idea was let's do one episode on biblical being problematic.
It never works.
Nope, and I don't even think we'll get through all of it today. So I'm sorry, but this, I don't know, feels relevant these days.
Why?
Yeah. Are you good, by the way? I mean, everything okay?
Yep.
I watched Andor. Did I tell you this? Andor season 1 and 2.
You watched it?
Bro.
And?
Oh, Andor. So Tim is kind of my entry point into pop culture. He has a pop culture encyclopedia in his brain that is just expansive and introduces me to things that I'm missing in the Marvel universe, the Star Wars universe, really the universe, if we're just going to throw that out there. And anyway, Andor, phenomenal. Big Nate and I watched seasons 1, 2, then we watched Rogue One, and then we watched A New Hope. And it was just like, oh, so great.
That's the best run of Star Wars right there.
It is. That whole thing, I was so impressed with that. I know no one cares, except the guy that came to fix our internet yesterday. Saw a Star Destroyer on my shelf that Nate and I put together Lego-wise, and then he was here for half an hour longer just talking about how much he's excited that his wife has gotten into it, and they're trying to watch everything in order.
Oh, wow. Like in chronological order?
Yes, chronological order. So,
Very
think
fun.
about how many between Clone Wars and Rebels, and that's just a lot of stuff. Mandalorian.
That is a lot.
So, thankfully, for you non-Star Wars folks, we're done with this part of conversation.
What?
But you know what? Let's talk about biblical.
Okay.
Biblical. How is it, Tim, that we escape? Is it even possible to escape from the tangled web of self-defined biblical interpretations that are out there? The Bible clearly says all of these people who disagree. So how in the world do we talk about this? And so episode 1 was talking about, speaking of episodes in order, was talking about the problematic usage of biblical. It can often be a cover. It can be a shorthand form of ideology that just robs us of the need to discern.
Would you say it's a phantom menace?
It is. Biblical can be a phantom menace. And it produces clones because then you don't have to think, right? And only at the end is there revenge.
Boom.
Lucasfilm, we're here if you need us. No problem. So the second part is a way of approaching the text that doesn't guarantee infallible results, right? There aren't infallible interpretations. Because there aren't infallible interpreters. But I really like, and I've used this in teaching and preaching in my own sort of study for years now. It's from Brandon O'Brien, and he talks about the world of the text, the world behind the text and the world in front of the text. And so last episode we talked about the text. And very often we skip over things that are super important, whether it's repeated patterns or the way the words are arranged, or metaphors, similes, allusions, hyperbole, genre clues. Like the text gives us far more, I think, than we realize, than when we're just sitting, down in English and going, okay, what does this verse mean to me? I mean, there's a great deal that the text is identifying, but we're just not trained to look for it. Or sometimes English actually can obscure it. So the world of the text is its own thing. And so, we just talked about literally just reading the Bible with a notebook that's next to you that just says, okay, so here's verse 1 of Mark. This is the genesis of Jesus, the Son of God, the Son of David. And it's just like you'd write, okay, Son of David, what's that mean? And then Mark gets into Isaiah, and it's like, okay, well, why does this Isaiah quote matter here? And I mean, that's just how when you're curious, the text just sort of opens up. If you don't assume you already know what it's saying, which is a huge deal.
Yeah.
So that's part one, is the world of the text. Part two is the world behind the text. And what O'Brien means here is it's discerning how the social, cultural, historical, and biblical context out of which the text was written affect its meaning. So what are the parts of the text that the author just assumes that his audience would know, that he takes no pains to highlight? And there are times when in the text, like in the book of Acts, Luke is writing to a Gentile named Theophilus. All right, so Luke is the author of Luke Acts, and Theophilus is his patron. So Theophilus is paying for this and having it printed and whatever else. And Theophilus is Gentile. And one of the ways that we know that is because when Luke is reciting what happened to Judas, he takes the Hebrew word and then adds in their own language, that is the field of blood. So he's assuming, so he quotes a Hebrew word and then explains what the Hebrew word means to Theophilus, because that would have been foreign to Theophilus and it was needed for the meaning. And so there are times, like even in the book of John, when that John will tell his readers about a feast and then say it was a feast of the Jews. It was a feast of the Jews. So it just wasn't assumed that you knew that. And so what behind the text is intended to get at is what the author assumes that his audience already knows that he doesn't have to explain. Right? So we've just got a couple of examples of where, hey, here's a word and I need to explain it, or here's a tradition, I need to explain it. But there's a whole host of things going on behind the text that the author doesn't need to explain to the audience he's writing to. And it's there that we have to do, really some of the big, important work, right? So it can be a matter of language or geography or culture. But if it's assumed if it's assumed by the author that the reader or listener will understand it, it's located then behind the text. And in a lot of this, we're just not aware of.
Yeah.
Because we don't read the Bible as a kind of a unified whole that references itself a lot. We read it in sort of these individual nuggets, or we hear it as a 30-minute sermon. And so behind the text are things like the events, the social systems, like forms of government, economics, family structures, the cultural dynamics, histories, geographies, and other assumptions that the original author shared in common with the original audience. And so, when you're reading something about the system of patronage, they're not going to explain that because this was just, everyone knew how the world worked in this regard. Or slavery, what slavery would have meant and not meant in that world. Whereas we have to do work to actually kind of get back in there. And we do have very superficial ways of doing that, right? You go to Bible Gateway and you look up every name or place or event that's mentioned in the text, and it will give you other instances of that in other texts. Because very often what's behind one text is another text.
Right.
And we'll talk about that in a second. There are Bible, I think it's BibleMaps.com. where when a place is mentioned, Jesus went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Okay, well, that actually has some significance when you look on a map and what that would have meant. Or, and this is a big one, whenever you come across a social convention, any mention of government or slavery or marriage, any cultural institution, to put the brakes on thinking that maps onto 21st century nuclear family culture or 21st century American democracy. And I know we all know that when we pull it out into the open, but the temptation is to just read about slavery and immediately think about American history, or to read about marriage and immediately think about nuclear families, or to read about politics or economics and assume capitalism or democracy. And so one of the things that is the hardest to do is to begin to ask questions, not just of the text itself, but are there things in the text itself that tell us there are things behind the text that are going on? Now, every text does have something behind it because it's written in a way that was separate from us by language, by culture, by time, by distance. I mean, all of those things. So every text has something behind it. But very often, the Bible riffs on itself and will include stories that reference other stories without ever telling you. So like in the story of Samson, the story of Samson is driven by an understanding of the Nazirite vow, which is given in, I think, the book of Numbers. And so the whole cutting of the hair thing isn't just this weird superpower. It's actually a Nazirite vow. And it was showing that when Samson was dedicated to the Lord, he had power. And when he was not, he didn't. Mm-hmm. Or like when we used the example of Ruth, the Moabitess. Last episode, we talked about how the author identifies Ruth, mentions her 12 times. 6 of those times he mentions she's a Moabitess from Moab. Well, that's letting us know that that's really integral to understanding the part of the story. And when you do, like you just type Moab into Google or into, BibleGateway.com or whatever, you find out that the Moabites, there's a history there. Israelites at that time detested anyone from Moab. The Moabites had very questionable origins. In a really weird story in Genesis 19, Lot has his 2 daughters have sex with Lot, and they both get pregnant, as you do. And the child of the eldest daughter is named Moab, and and is sort of like the father of the Moabites. The child of the younger daughter is named Ammon, whose descendants are the Ammonites. And so these 2 nations turn out to be thorns in Israel's side for a lot of the Old Testament. The Moabites will lead Israel into idolatry during their wilderings and Numbers. They will fight against Israel when they try to inherit the promised land in Joshua. And for all of these reasons, Moabites and Ammonites were banned from worship in Israel's temple. In fact, Deuteronomy 23 says, no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord even to the 10th generation. So when the text is telling us, here's Ruth the Moabitess, and she's so covenantally faithful to Naomi, her mother-in-law, that she actually inhabits the virtues of hesed, steadfast love, right? We're shocked. We're shocked when Ruth demonstrates to Israel what Yahweh was asking of Israel. Mm-hmm. Right? And I mean, and this sort of thing happens all the time, but you wouldn't get that if you weren't paying attention to, is there a history here with Moab? And it's even crazier when Ruth shows up as part of the lineage of David, and then the lineage, of course, through David of Jesus the Messiah. And so, like, there's a massive amount of theological meaning sitting there behind the text that's just sort of assumed. Yeah, Moabites, man, none of them, they don't even get to go into the temple. And here one is a central part of the genealogy of Jesus. And so, I mean, you get these in the New Testament too. Like at the church I was teaching at, or the church I teach at, we were looking at Parable of the Good Samaritan, and somebody stands up to test Jesus. Now, the test there isn't like, hey, Jesus, do you know the right answers? The test there in an honor and shame culture is a way of vying for public respect and honor. So if there's somebody publicly teaching and you ask them a question, if they answer the question well, they grow in public esteem. Or if they can sort of sidestep the question in a kind of ingenious way, they grow in public esteem. And the question asker either stays neutral or loses esteem. So in an honor shame culture, tests, public questions were tests that the community would then judge the winner and accord increased respect and esteem to one or the other. And so it's the reason why this teacher, this Torah scholar, comes up and says, "Hey, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, you're the Torah scholar. How do you read it?" "Well, love God, love neighbor." And then it says, "And the man wanting to justify himself." So that doesn't mean that means being shown to be in the right or to be superior. Said, "Who is my neighbor?" So he's asking Jesus to enter into these really tricky sort of first century debates. And Jesus gives the parable of the Good Samaritan. But the point there is that this is happening behind the text, and you wouldn't be paying attention to it if you didn't know that tested him didn't mean we weren't sure Jesus knew the answer, but rather it was an honor display between a Torah scholar who would have been highly, highly regarded in the community and this Galilean peasant who, because of his miraculous works, was growing in acclaim, but seemed to be doing some things that didn't accord with the spirit of the age. Make sense, Tim?
Yeah.
That was convincing, exciting, and delighted all at once.
I was thinking about how now if you can't answer a question correctly, we elect you president.
Wow. And a bomb has been dropped. Tim, the purple hat just says, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I don't care." That's what that says. Deal with it. Deal with it. So you've got the text. You've got, and I'm sorry if this is tedious. I'm trying to get through it.
I don't think it is. I think you're anytime people are bringing, Jesus does this often, obviously, where he's we'll bring in a twofold, he'll answer a question, but there will be, we talked about this last week, right? Where he goes through the whole Sermon on the Mount, it then sums it up. Mm-hmm. So there's always a smaller answer and then a larger answer.
Always.
Or even just talking about metaphor, we do that in the classroom all the time. What happens when someone uses a metaphor and it brings all of the context that's involved with the metaphor into whatever example they're making. So it's it's important to understand that stuff because it, otherwise you're missing so much context that goes in with whatever the statement is. So I think this is all very relevant and not tedious.
Well, we're trying to avoid two errors, right? Which Sarah last episode identified, right? On the one hand, we all need a good dose of humility when it comes to the Bible.
Amen. Or
we just all do. But there are some of us who need a dose of confidence when it comes to the Bible too. And because part of one of the things I hear personally from people is, well, if I've understood this incorrectly, then how can I trust anything I've ever learned?
Totally. Yep.
Totally.
I see what you're saying. Yep.
And so we don't want to engender that either.
Right.
Because our English translations are good and they're produced, the vast majority of them are produced by really, really great scholars. I think there are a couple that I probably wouldn't recommend, but other than that, I'm just so we're just the amount of scholarship that just sits compared to what the world has had for 2,000 years. It's ridiculous.
That's a whole nother.
Yeah.
Because we'll talk about that often with what the house churches that Paul's writing to, what they were working with and how many people could read and how many people could interpret and how often these letters would even show up, how much time was in between. So what were they doing in between all that?
Yeah.
Because we're just we're inundated with information and they had the opposite.
Yeah.
So
you would have Torah.
Yeah.
Unless you were in Gentile communities and then you were what's that?
Right. Totally.
You would have the oral traditions around Jesus, and then you would have eyewitness testimony around Jesus. And then Paul starts writing letters that soon began to be grouped together. But yeah, I mean, you didn't have much. And so,
which I think is really fascinating.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But you had the Spirit, right? The Spirit of Christ among you.
What does that even mean?
Well, we're going to get there, bro. That's part of this conversation, because you have the world of the text, you have the world behind it, you have the world in front of it. And then it's not static. The text doesn't come to us as a static, fixed set of literature on golden tablets that just doesn't like move, like it's living and active according to its own testimony.
Well, that's the thing too, and I think we've touched on, like, Jesus is like the rock in the pond with the ripples,
right?
And so every time I come across something where it was like something I was told before that I found is incorrect, which is what you're commenting on, like when somebody is confronted with maybe the creation account is not the way that you learned it, then it's like, well, if that's not true, then I lose everything. Or if the flood wasn't the flood the way we were brought up with felt boards, then maybe we have to throw the whole thing out. But Jesus informs forward and backwards is where I've found the most encouragement with that kind of stuff. Is like, as I have to reinterpret or learn new things, that's a lot of what he was doing, right? That's a lot of like, you heard it said, but I say. It's like, so then everything starts to kind of fall into its contextual place, and you learn where there's kind of like flexibility and not flexibility or whatever. But so I find that kind of stuff encouraging. Yeah. And that's the conversations I try to have with people when they are first entering into this stuff. They're like, oh no, I have to throw it all out. And it's like, no.
And in fact, I mean, the Bible itself segments its like importance. In other words, it's not an all or nothing thing. There are issues that are of first importance, that without which you're not a Christian. I mean, at the end of the day. And then there are matters that are disputable, according to Paul. And then there are matters that are like, hey, I just wish you guys would do this.
Yeah. And then, like you said at the beginning, the infallibility, because it's written by like fallible hands and fallible minds and
in
fallible
union
interpretations. Right. But it's just that tension.
Yeah.
No one's comfortable with that tension because we're such absolutists. So it's like, and it doesn't make it not absolute. It's like all of our not interpretations, our understandings of things are so two-dimensional and static. And I think more so now than they were even in some other time periods where people were, I don't know. It's just that tension. I love that tension because it makes this so much bigger and more like you have to really enter into it. Otherwise, it's just like, if it's not written on a piece of paper, then I can't trust it.
Yeah. Yep.
But I think it's so much more juicy and thick. And, when I look out the universe and we keep learning more and more about the expanse, like just what's out there, it makes everything seem, it just validates so much more for me. And so I need God to be bigger than that. You know what I mean? Because
you'd hope so.
If science outgrows God, well, then I'm in a really weird quandary.
Yeah. Oh man.
But the fact that this gets bigger and bigger, I love it.
Yeah.
I need it to grow. I need to never be able to grasp it all.
Totally. And I think, no, go ahead.
No, I just need to keep chasing. I enjoy the chase. And I feel like there's certain things that Paul will say too, where it's like, this is a race that you don't finish. Like you just keep running and running and running and running and running and running and running. And if I feel like if I did finish, I'd be like, okay, cool. I guess I understood that. Now what? Like, do I need to go look somewhere else for something else? I need God to be big.
Yeah. Well, I've got good news. Turns out. So let's talk about in front of the text. And so this is kind of the mirror image of behind the text. It's all the assumptions that I bring. My individual history, my social location, my economic status, my level of education, my language. I mean,
my desires.
Oh my goodness, I am packing so much. And that's why we need all three of these to work together. Totally. Because there's a whole crew of people that doesn't acknowledge they bring anything to the text. And then there's a whole crew of people that think all they bring to the text is them. And so they can't trust anything. And that's not true either. And so there's the tension between the text itself and how it's working, the what's happening behind the text, and then what we bring to it, and then we'll add the dynamic of the Spirit of God in. And again, what we're after isn't the perfect doctrinal statement or list of factual beliefs, but rather we want to be a faithful and discerning community, right? That's the point of, I think, the point of the text. That's what the text is supposed to give birth to, is a community that tries to continue the incarnation of Jesus in the world. So I know, dude, you're an English guy, but you've had the experience where you've read the same book twice, but maybe in a gap separated by 20 years, and it's a totally different reading experience.
Yeah.
Because you've changed. The text hasn't changed.
Totally.
You read, right? You read the thing. I read Harry Potter, when I was 30, and then I read Harry Potter when I'm 50. Not that I am, but I'm saying hypothetically.
When you turn 50.
It's like, it's two different reading experiences. I can't tell you, like, there are times like certain Bible verses have just fallen on deaf ears and hard hearts. And then there are other times you'll hear that same verse and it just speaks to you. And so that the fact that the text doesn't change, but we do, that's what's being captured here by O'Brien's idea of being in the front of the text. It's like the lenses out of which or through which you read the text. And obviously, I mean, this makes sense, but it's like the families we grew up in, the religious experiences we have, the ways we were formed to think about God before we were even aware that we were being formed to think about God, right? It's all of the events, social systems, dynamics, histories, geographies, and other assumptions that I don't even know that I think, but I bring them to the text. And so when I see armor of God, I think, oh, okay, well, that's individual armor.
Mm-hmm.
That's like
that's what they sold to us when we were kids at the Christian bookstore.
Absolutely.
Little plastic
fruit of the
set.
Spirit, potpourri. Yes. and if we don't, we're not defeated by this, but we have to be aware of it and account for it. And if we're not, then we either just throw the text behind our subjectivity forever. We can never encounter the real text or God's intentions behind it. Or, hey, it is like the postmoderns think, it's just a power game. Whatever, any reading of the text that claims to be a true reading is automatically a power game to be used to, oppress and marginalize some other group. And I don't think that that's how it works, but we do have to acknowledge that the in front of the text, it determines what details we'll notice and what details we think are important. It influences how I will prioritize a text or assess a text. So O'Brien references another book where, and I think I hinted at this a couple of episodes ago, but there was a guy was teaching the story of the prodigal son. And the prodigal son finds himself starving. And there's a famine in the land, and the prodigal son finds himself starving. He had squandered all of his wealth. No one was sharing any food with him, and there was a famine in the land. Those are the three explanations given for why he was starving. All right. And this is really important. So there's a famine. No one was sharing anything. No one gave him anything to eat. And he'd squandered his wealth. Now, when he taught this to Russians, the Russians, if they were asked, why was the guy hungry, would say, because there was a famine in the land. Right?
Mm-hmm.
When he asked Americans, why was the guy hungry? Because he squandered all of his wealth. When he asked Africans, why was the guy hungry? They would say, because no one shared anything with him to eat. I mean, bro, all three of those answers are biblical. They're given in the text. There's a famine, he squandered, and no one shared food with him. But isn't it interesting, just in the tiniest way, what we bring to the text determines or greatly filters what it is that we pull out of it. I just thought that was so brilliant. I've never noticed that before, that there are 3 reasons given for why he's starving.
Yeah.
Because I always looked at the squandering the wealth.
Totally.
The guy, yeah. And O'Brien's point is, well, yeah, as Americans, that's what we notice first.
Yeah.
But if you've ever been in a country that has a famine in recent memory, because this was years and years ago, man, the famine is what jumps
do you think
out.
In the parable itself, Jesus was like layering that out purposefully? Like,
who knows? It wouldn't shock me.
You know what I mean, though? But it's like, is there foresight to exactly what you're saying, that the human filter or the human lenses that we bring to? Because obviously he would do that too with the way he would use specific metaphors, or the way he would use specific callbacks to stuff in Torah or whatever, that he knew that they understood, because then he was, helping them to bring context to something that he was saying, to kind of like, fully form it. So it's the same thing in some regard, to say he's doing that with a backwards lens, but this would be like a kind of a forward lens of.
Bro, it wouldn't shock me. I mean,
it would make a lot of sense. It doesn't change the parable, right? Because it's like, so it would make a lot of sense that intent was there.
It's one of those things. The longer I follow Jesus, the bigger he gets. Mm-hmm. And the longer I study the Bible, the bigger the Bible gets. And so it would not shock me. His parables were so well constructed. Now, a lot of his parables aren't unique to Jesus. This was a very common. We have examples of parables. Like, what's that?
Even that's intentional for like.
Absolutely, it is.
Just talking about other. When we were talking about, I don't know, when we're going through Genesis and we talk about flood narratives and other. That's regions and stories and religions, and some of them that predate that text.
Totally.
Obviously, when you tell a story like that, it's bringing in the context of other things, which then will be spun on its head for whatever purpose to.
That's right. To show the uniqueness of Yahweh.
Exactly. So it makes a lot of sense. I don't know. It's
well, fun. Remember, you beautifully illustrate the fact, and I love how Mackey and the Bible Project capture this. This is a human and divine word.
Yes.
And so we have to respect the divinity of the text and the humanity of the text.
And that should be at the front of every Bible. It should. Totally. It'd be like, this is how you even begin, before you even read Genesis 1.
Yeah.
It's important for you to understand that this is inspired, but also like
written by
there are divine fingerprints and human fingerprints.
That's right.
That's part of that's
and they don't cancel each other out.
They don't, but they create a much more complex and then again full of tension piece, which is what we are.
Yeah. Yep. Well said, Timothy. To try to be aware of what I'm bringing to the text. These are the kinds of questions. I don't like literally sit down and ask these, but they're sort of ingrained in the way my brain works. In what ways am I like the characters or unlike the characters of the story?
Who am I in this particular piece?
And who is the character I relate with? Because if I'm not careful, often I'm relating to Jesus. Look at these horrible religious people. Right? I just think I'm a hermeneutical narcissist, and I just think, yes, of course. Jesus is plucking grains. Yes. And then the religious leaders come and criticize him. And
those fools.
Those fools. Exactly. Man. So in what ways are you like or unlike the characters of the story? So like you read the book of Ruth and I'm like, I'm nothing like her. Mm-hmm. Nothing. And I have to take that into account when I'm reading that story, that if I come across something that just doesn't sit, my first instinct can't be, this is just an ancient horrific book here. My first instinct rather is, okay, there's something going on that I'm missing, either in the text behind it or something I'm bringing to it.
Or what can I learn from? I mean, we do this in the classroom all the time. Like this is reading text from demographics that you have nothing in common with, teach you so much, and a lot about yourself too.
Yep. Other questions are things like, what details are in the text versus what details jump out to you? So sometimes I will just circle details, like try to get every detail of a text or story, but then I'll like highlight the ones that jumped out originally, and I'll just note the difference, and wonder if, I wonder if there's something there that made me ignore the other two explanations for why the guy's hungry, and just focus on the squandering wealth one. Which, so I'm trying to compare my social location with the social location of the reader, the audience, the listeners. And I think that's, I think, as you say, a lot of the Bible represents minority voices. And I don't mean minority in the American like sense, but I mean voices from the fringes. When you read the prophets, these are not people in the center of Israelite culture. When you're hearing eyewitness testimony from the disciples, these are not the best and the brightest. When you're reading John in Revelation, right, you're talking about empire from the margins of empire. And so the discipline of trying to keep the difference in, because I mean, I am Egypt, I am Babylon, I am Rome, right? That's just my social location. We are empire. And so what are the texts that really make me uncomfortable? And paying attention to those sorts of things, really, really important. All right. One last little bit, and we'll call it a short episode, for which our audience will say, thank you.
Dankeschön.
Yeah. The dynamic of the Spirit. And here, I'm in constant battle, and I think you are too, Tim, between over spiritualizing and under spiritualizing. Everywhere. Yeah. Well, yeah. Okay. Never. Maybe I'm in more of a battle than you are. But like, I do think this is a God-bathed universe. I do. And I want to experience the enchantment and the joy and the wonder of living in the world that we do. I don't want to ever look at fingerprints and not be amazed at them, or snowflakes or frogs or whatever. When it comes to the Bible, I want to make room for the Spirit of God to do the Spirit of God stuff, but I also don't want to just give every little opinion I have, thus saith the Lord, weight, as if it were divinely inspired. And so if we're going to approach the text, though, with some understanding of inspiration, then there is a dance partner here that's outside of the text too. That's the Spirit. So the Spirit, according to Paul, is at work in the text. It's God-breathed. And which is this beautiful, remember, God-breathed also refers to humans, right? The breath of God in the nostril. So something can be God-breathed and still fully human. It's not like God dictated to these people. He used their personalities, their histories, what they were bringing to the text. And so the Spirit is at work in it. And so whether you use the word inspiration or I have no trouble with the word like authority, the authority of the text. Like for me, the text is determinative in matters of faith and practice. The issue is that there are places of first importance, there are places of second importance, and there are places of third importance. So I weigh those sorts of things out. And so when we look at, literary features or genres or idioms, right, we're seeing this God-breathed process at work, that I'm trusting that God is conveying accurate communication. But because he's doing it through humans at a specific time and place, that isn't automatic. I have to do work behind that. And so I think the Spirit is at work in the text. I think the Spirit is at work behind the text, meaning there's a lot of Paul's thought about at just the right time, Jesus of Nazareth was put forward. Like, I'm not thinking there's anything superior about the Greek language, but when you look at the history of language, like between Roman roads and the Koine Greek that was spoken, there was a lot that was friendly to the expansion of the message of Jesus in that time. So there's nothing holy necessarily behind all of the culture, but I'm trusting that at just the right time, God inspired the people who wrote the thing. You know what I mean? So I think he's even at work behind the text in the cultural situations out of which they're drawing.
And even that's three-dimensional, though. It's not like it's whether there's autonomy, whether there's human autonomy in all of us, you know, free will or whatever you want to call it. Even that, so even that divine time period, or you said like not saying it's all holy, but and then it kind of is though in a weird, like larger sense. So it's like there's just always so much more than just the like two-dimensional angle of approaching it. Again, I know I keep saying that, but it's just like every time you bring up a new point, it seems like it always harkens back to the fact that we want just this simple thing, but this is saying, no, I'm asking a little bit more of you than that. Like, you have to engage. And then even when you just said like authority, remember when before we did the To Be Human, I was asking you about, I don't know if it was on the podcast or if we were just talking about what reign means to us, like REIG. Yeah. And our understanding of reign is a very like oppressive kind of idea. And so sometimes when we hear some of that text, we bring in these oppressive ideas, but that doesn't mean that that's what that means. That just means that that's our understanding of that word. So even authority, immediately I think of authoritarian, or I think of something that's not willing to listen or to give you any leeway or freedom within it. It's just this thing that rains down on you. See, there's in that way. And it's like, but authority is even a little bit different. Than you know what I mean? So it's just like that you even have to like, you have to take a step back and allow, and that's just one word describing the text before you even enter into the text.
Totally. That's where, and we've talked about this before, but man, that's where N.T. Wright's really helped me understand how the text is authoritative. And you remember this, bro, the Shakespearean play,
the 5 acts
analogy. So if you haven't heard this, it's worth a minor digression. But suppose you were part of a troupe of actors and actresses whose job it was to faithfully inhabit and perform Shakespearean theater. That was your goal. And suppose a new play was discovered. And it gave you the first 4 acts, the beginning of the 5th act, and the end of the 5th act. But the middle part of the 5th act was missing. What would you do? And NT argues, well, part of what you would do, if your goal was to faithfully perform this piece of theater, you would immerse yourself in the 4 acts that were already established, and the beginning of the 5th act and the end of the 5th act. And then you would do your best to improvise using the authority of the first 4 acts, the beginning and end of the 5th act, as the rule of performance. You were trying to inhabit, with all of that background information in mind, and perform faithfully to what Shakespeare might have had in mind when he commissioned this play or wrote this play. And he's like, in that way, the Bible has authority for those of us who want to perform the gospel of Christ well in the world.
Yeah, it's a great example.
It's a great example. Meaning, like, I hear authority and it's like, okay, well, the Bible says you're going to hell. And certainly we can get into all those sorts of wonderful conversations. But the Bible is primarily written to people who already believe in Jesus, right? I mean, this is to be a disciple. This is like, hey, you guys want to perform Jesus well? All right, let's talk about faithful performances.
Yeah.
And in that way, it's an authority. So that when we're comparing performances, one church is performing Christ in a way that seems to be focusing on power over and marginalizing enemies and alienating. And another church is performing Jesus in a way that seems to be humble and trite and meek. Like, what do we appeal to for the standard of performance? Well, we appeal to the text. And in that way, right? So it's not about our rightness necessarily, but our faithfulness.
Yeah. So our modern American authorities are, it's like a disciplinary action, right? It's like if you are speeding, you get a ticket and maybe lose your license, or if you do X, Y, and Z, here's the consequences of it. So the authority always looms over us. Or I don't know if you ever had to read this at some point in college, the Panopticon.
Oh, no, that sounds so cool.
It's this idea that they'd build these prisons in a circle, and in the middle, and someone would probably correct me if I'm butchering this, it's been a minute since I read it, but in the middle would be a guard tower, but there'd be no guards in it. But you didn't know because the windows were dark or whatever, and so people would self-govern out of the idea of punishment, or out of the threat.
Ooh.
That alone would cause people to fall in line, and you didn't have to even have guards there because people would just out of fear. And I feel like we do that. Like we have a panoptic, not a synoptic, but a panoptic gospel where
look
it's
at
like
you go.
But you know what I mean? Like so the authority is something we fear because our understanding of that is, penal substitution, or however you want to frame it. But instead, the authority, as you're saying, is to say, hey, this is the truth, and the truth has the authority because it's true, and therefore that informs how we can trust that authority to then improvise from that point or whatever.
That's right.
So it's not fear, it forms
I want to follow Jesus.
Right.
What does that look like?
Not because I'm afraid.
The Bible doesn't cover. Yeah, exactly.
Jesus wasn't like, hey guys, this is how you live, do it, or
well, he gave some ors, like,
but not in the way that we have, like,
yes.
He didn't try to coerce.
No.
Is maybe the way
he
to
would
put that.
Warn. So, like, if you obey my teaching, it's like somebody who built his house on the rock. Or if you don't, it's like someone who built their house on the sand. It's not a threat as much as it is, hey, if you invest on treasures on earth, they'll be destroyed.
That's the truth of authority.
Yeah.
It's kind of good parenting, or even like,
biblical parenting.
Teaching grammar in the classroom. I like the whole, like, let's eat grandma. Like, whether or not you put that
commas matter
dictates quite a bit of interpretation. But if I was to have to teach that in the classroom, it would be not out of threat. Like, if you write this incorrectly, I'm going to hit you.
Right.
It would be, hey, if you do this incorrectly, people will not understand what you're doing. There is a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this. And if you do it the incorrect way, you're messing or whatever. You know what I mean? So it's like it feels like a fine line distinction.
Yeah.
How you understand authority, and how, and then why you allow it to be authoritative, I guess.
Yes, for sure. That's good, dude. I'm going to postpone. We have one more section. How do we, when we disagree over text, how do we do that well and rightly? So we'll do that next episode. Well, I mean, I just think, like,
Crusades, right?
Well, my wife and I was having a discussion. We were having a discussion between the difference between being theologically conservative and being politically conservative. Because she will often, she is both. She is very politically conservative and very theologically conservative. And she'll question, like, hey, but you said this, how can you say that you're theologically conservative? And it's like, well, the application of theology can fall into those partisan camps, but you know what I mean? So like there are these layers upon layers of, even when you get to like immigration, at what point can we just look at it and say, well, this is really clear, because it seems really clear, while thoughtfully disagreeing about the best way to do this. We don't seem to have that ability to disagree theologically well.
No, we're getting a little worse at it.
So Anyway, that'll be a portion of next episode, and we'll have a report from Southern California.
A report.
Yes. All right, friends. Romans, countrymen and women, thank you for lending us your ear. Speaking of Shakespeare, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. The VOXOLOGY podcast is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is made possible by listeners just like you. If you'd like to partner with us, you can do so at patreon.com/VOXOLOGY podcast or on Tithely, tithe.ly, and just search VOXOLOGY podcast. Links for both are in the show notes and on our website. You can interact with the hosts on Facebook/VOXOLOGY podcast or on Instagram at VOXOLOGY podcast and on Twitter or X, whatever it is, at Mike Erie. Thank you for walking this long road with us.